A sudden, inexplicable voice urged him to act, and against all logic, the pilot pushed for an early takeoff. In just 3 fateful minutes, he turned a routine flight into a life-saving miracle for 148 passengers. Ricoa Mafella was no ordinary pilot. With decades of experience etched into every measured decision he made in the cockpit, he had long been revered for his unwavering commitment to protocol and safety. His career was studded with incidents where his calm resolve, tested by sudden weather changes, technical malfunctions, and unexpected emergencies, had ensured that every flight ended with a safe landing. To his colleagues, Ricoa was a bastion of rationality, a man who believed that fate bowed to discipline and the immutable rules of aviation. His hands, weathered yet steady on the yoke, had steered him through countless challenges that might have shaken a lesser man. Yet beneath this reputation of stoic rationality lay a complexity few knew. Ricoa was meticulous and methodical, always relying on instruments and training over gut feelings. Even in moments of turbulence, both literal and metaphorical, he trusted the cold logic of numbers and checklists. His first officer, a young pilot known for his impulsive brilliance and daring maneuvers, provided a striking contrast. Where Ricoa was measured and deliberate, the first officer often embraced spontaneity, sometimes clashing with Ricoa's conservative approach. Their dynamic, though respectful, hinted at an undercurrent of tension, a subtle conflict of ideologies that would later add layers to the unfolding events of the day. In every flight he commanded, Ricoa's inner voice was one of certainty and calm, until today. That morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ricoa felt an inexplicable heaviness press upon his mind. It was as though an unseen weight had settled on his shoulders, a silent warning from a force beyond rational explanation. His sleep had been disturbed by a particularly vivid dream. He found himself ensnared in an endless labyrinth of dark, swirling clouds. In that surreal vision, he was trapped, the inky tendrils of the storm constricting around him with no apparent escape. The dream left him with an uneasy residue, a lingering sense of foreboding that defied all logical interpretation. Upon arriving at the airport, the world around him seemed to carry a subtle, otherworldly charge. Amid the usual hustle of travelers and crew, a small detail caught his eye, a young boy standing silently among the crowd. The child's gaze was unervingly intense, fixed directly on Ricoa as if trying to communicate an urgent, wordless message. The boy's eyes shone with an almost ethereal quality, a mixture of sorrow and warning that sent a shiver down Ricoa's spine. Was it merely a trick of the light, or did that piercing stare herald a deeper, unspoken truth? Ricoa couldn't shake the impression that the universe was hinting at something monumental, something that defied the everyday routine of air travel. Every step he took through the terminal, every casual conversation he overheard, was tinged with this sense of impending change. The usual mundane announcements over the PA system now seemed to carry hidden meanings, as if each word was a clue in a cryptic puzzle that Ricoa was destined to unravel. The day's normalcy was beginning to crumble beneath a veneer of eerie anticipation. As the day advanced and final preparations for the flight were underway, the signs of an approaching calamity became increasingly evident. A fierce gust of wind, sudden and uncharacteristic, forced a significant delay, 99 minutes, to the scheduled landing of another aircraft. While such delays were not unheard of, the intensity and irregularity of the wind hinted at more than mere meteorological happenstance. To the untrained eye, it might have been dismissed as a routine quirk of nature, but Ricoa's seasoned instincts told him otherwise. The sky itself had transformed into a vast, ominous canvas. The brilliant blue was replaced by a heavy, ashen gray that seemed to mute the vibrancy of the day. Overhead, clouds churned in a restless dance, their edges dark and indistinct as if concealing secrets too dire to be seen. Ground crew members exchanged uneasy glances and muttered in hushed tones, remarks like, "There's something off about today's weather," and "I can feel it in my bones." Even the radar systems, those steadfast guardians of the airspace, began to display minor irregularities. Flickering readings and sporadic lapses in transmission could easily have been chalked up to technical glitches. Yet in the charged atmosphere of the airport, every anomaly felt loaded with portent. Adding to the unsettling tableau was the presence of a visibly distressed woman who boarded the plane with trembling hands and a haunted look. Her anxiety was palpable, a silent scream that reverberated through the cabin despite her best efforts to remain calm. Although she eventually settled into her seat, the memory of her anxious demeanor lingered in the air, a subtle but unmistakable sign that all was not well. In every detail, the disruptive delay, the eerie sky, the peculiar behavior of both man and machine, a tapestry of ominous hints was being woven. It was as if the fabric of the day was being torn apart at the seams, ready to reveal a disaster that had been quietly gathering strength in the background. As Ricoa stepped into the cockpit, the familiar hum of pre-flight routines was suddenly drowned out by a shiver that raced along his spine. In that silent, charged moment, a voice, clear and insistent, echoed in the recesses of his mind. "Get out now. Leave now." At first, Ricoa dismissed it as a fleeting figment of his imagination, a trick of the mind born from fatigue, or perhaps the lingering remnants of that unsettling dream. But the words repeated themselves, relentless and unyielding, each iteration intensifying the chill that crept over him. The voice wasn't a whisper borne by the wind or the static of his radio. It was an inner call, almost a primal alarm that disrupted the normally sterile calm of his cockpit. In an attempt to quell the rising tide of disquiet, Ricoa began softly humming a hymn he had known since childhood, a melody that once soothed his nerves during long, lonely flights. But today, the notes seemed warped, imbued with a strange urgency rather than the usual comfort. The familiar cadence now sounded almost desperate, as if echoing the silent plea of the voice. With every measured note, he felt the internal resistance of logic clash with an instinct he couldn't quite rationalize. Was this an aberration, a malfunction in his mind, or a genuine alert from some unfathomable source? The answer eluded him, yet the voice's command persisted, inscribing itself into his consciousness with each reverberation. Ricoa's hands tightened on the controls as the internal conflict mounted. The voice was not a mere echo of anxiety. It carried a weight, a demand that broke through the veneer of his habitual calm. It was as though an unseen force was tugging at the very fabric of his decision-making, urging him to abandon all protocols and simply take off, to escape from a danger he couldn't yet see. In that moment, the cockpit transformed from a sanctum of reason into a battleground between cold rationality and an inexplicable, urgent warning that refused to be silenced. In the midst of the eerie quiet that followed the voice's command, Ricoa found himself locked in a silent duel with his own instincts. His mind raced as he weighed the stark reality of his years of rigorous training against the unyielding pressure of the inner voice. Should he heed that mysterious call, or dismiss it as a figment of an overactive imagination? The idea of deviating from the strict protocols he had so meticulously followed all his life sent a tremor of uncertainty through him. After all, breaking procedure wasn't just a minor infraction. It was an act that could endanger lives. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" his first officer asked, his voice tinged with concern as he noticed the unusual tension in Ricoa's expression. "Why the rush, Ricoa? This isn't like you." The question struck Ricoa with the force of a sledgehammer against his core convictions. His mind flashed back to past flights, moments when every decision was measured and calculated, a life built on unwavering discipline and trust in instruments. Yet, in that moment, his heart pounded with a certainty that defied logic. Memories of times when intuition had guided him away from unseen perils resurfaced, mingling with the ghostly cadence of the insistent voice. Was it possible that, in the crucible of life and death decisions, reason sometimes needed to yield to a deeper, almost supernatural understanding? Every fiber of his being seemed to pulse with that internal conflict. On one side lay the sacred rituals of flight safety, a system designed to protect every passenger on board. On the other, a mysterious, almost primal warning that screamed for immediate action. A warning that felt as if it were coming from a place beyond mere human reasoning. Ricoa felt an overwhelming sensation, as though invisible hands were pulling him toward an uncertain destiny, urging him to break free from the shackles of routine. The battle within him was fierce, a poignant struggle between the safe harbor of tradition and the dangerous allure of an unknown fate. It was in this heart-wrenching moment that Ricoa realized some decisions were not about right or wrong but about survival. A survival that might demand a leap of faith into the realm of the inexplicable. Just as the internal storm reached its peak, Ricoa's trembling resolve led him to the next critical step, contacting air traffic control. On the other end of the frequency was Anthony Ong, a dedicated controller known for his unwavering professionalism and caution. Anthony's voice, steady and measured, cut through the static as he inquired about the flight's status. "Ricoa, you're requesting an early takeoff clearance. That's highly irregular. We have another aircraft scheduled to land. What's the situation?" The question hung in the air, laden with the weight of responsibility. Ricoa hesitated only a moment before responding, his voice a mixture of urgency and uncertainty. "There's something. I can't explain it. I need to leave now." Anthony paused. Though his training dictated adherence to protocol, a subtle, unplaceable feeling stirred within him, a sense of unease that mirrored Ricoa's own. Over the radio, the usual order of operations faltered under the pressure of an inexplicable forewarning. In a rare act of intuitive judgment, Anthony scanned the systems one more time and listened to the distant, almost imperceptible murmur of a storm approaching. "Understood," Anthony finally said, his tone softening as he relayed the clearance. "You are cleared for takeoff, 3 minutes ahead of schedule. Stay safe, Ricoa." In that brief exchange, a fragile alliance was forged between a pilot haunted by inexplicable warnings and a controller who, against all odds, chose to trust his own instinct. The decision, fraught with risk and charged with the weight of destiny, set in motion events that neither could fully comprehend. Anthony's consent to an early takeoff was more than a procedural anomaly. It was an acknowledgement that sometimes, in the face of unseen perils, the rules must bend to the inscrutable demands of fate. Ricoa's hands gripped the controls with a fervor he had never before experienced. With a deep, steadying breath, he pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared to life, and in that moment, the world outside seemed to pause. A split second where time hung in a delicate balance. As the aircraft surged forward, leaving the familiar confines of the runway, Ricoa's heart pounded in his ears. Every fiber of his being was attuned to the subtle shift in momentum as the plane lifted gracefully into the sky. Through the cockpit windows, the ground receded rapidly, its details blurring into a tapestry of dark hues and shifting shadows. Yet, amid the routine ascent, Ricoa couldn't shake an unsettling sensation. It was as if the very air around him vibrated with an impending warning. As the wheels retracted and the fuselage stabilized, his eyes caught sight of something extraordinary below. A subtle, almost imperceptible trembling of the earth. In the distance, buildings and roads seemed to quiver, and an eerie ripple coursed across the landscape like a whispered secret of doom. He felt that these were no ordinary vibrations. There was a purposeful, almost sinister rhythm in the tremors, an ominous prelude to a disaster that was unfolding on the ground. Ricoa's mind raced. Had his decision to take off 3 minutes early been more than a mere deviation from protocol? In that critical juncture, while he soared upward into the safety of the sky, the land below was beginning to betray the calm facade of a typical day. Every second in the cockpit felt stretched into an eternity as the aircraft ascended, and with each passing moment, the ominous tremors below grew more pronounced. Ricoa's eyes remained fixed on the shifting earth, aware that this singular, fateful decision had potentially saved lives. Lives that might otherwise have been caught in the clutches of an unseen, approaching catastrophe. From the distant control tower, Anthony Ong watched the monitors as reality began to warp before his eyes. The once familiar screens now flickered with erratic signals, each glitch punctuating the growing chaos. Suddenly, the entire tower shuddered violently. An earthquake had struck. Anthony's heart pounded as the ground beneath him convulsed, and the metal structure of the control tower groaned under the strain. In a scene of utter pandemonium, Alarms wailed and lights flashed in a frenzied dance of impending doom. Outside the tower's reinforced glass, chaos reigned. Staff scattered in desperate haste, their shouts echoing through the trembling halls. Yet Anthony remained at his station, his eyes fixed on the radar and communication panels, determined to guide the last aircraft to safety despite the collapsing world around him. As the tremors intensified, he felt an almost prophetic certainty that this was no ordinary quake. It was the harbinger of something far worse. Then, in the distance, the first sight of the tsunami materialized, a towering, dark wall of water surging relentlessly toward the coast. The massive wave, like a monstrous entity spawned from the depths, rolled forward with terrifying speed and power. On the ground, terrified citizens could be heard screaming in unison as they attempted to flee the oncoming tidal force. In mere moments, entire neighborhoods were consumed by the overwhelming force of nature. Amid the chaos, the control tower itself began to buckle under the seismic fury. With no time to spare, Anthony made the split-second decision that would mark the ultimate sacrifice. With the final radio transmission still echoing in his ears and the monitors displaying the brutal advance of the tsunami, he stepped away from his console. In a final act of selfless courage, Anthony hurled himself from the collapsing tower. His leap a desperate bid to escape the crumbling edifice and perhaps, in that singular moment, to save a piece of himself from the unfolding tragedy. His figure, silhouetted against the raging backdrop of the disaster, was the last beacon of human determination before the chaos swallowed everything in its path. High above the tumultuous scene unfolding on the ground, Ricoa floated in a cocoon of relative safety, a stark contrast to the horror unfolding below. As the aircraft climbed steadily, the pilot's mind slowly shifted from the urgency of his earlier decision to a dawning realization of what might be transpiring on Earth. The instruments remained stable, the flight path unaltered, yet a nagging unease continued to gnaw at him. Peering out of the cockpit window, Ricoa's eyes were drawn to a distant, dark plume rising from the horizon. At first, he assumed it was merely the result of residual smoke from the bustling city below, but as the minutes passed, the plume grew denser and more ominous. The horizon, once filled with the promise of a clear sky, was now marred by an ever-expanding shroud of smoke and dust. In that moment, Ricoa's heart sank as he recalled the strange tremors he had seen just after takeoff. Had his fateful decision, this critical 3-minute difference, truly saved lives? In the distance, the signs of disaster became undeniable. What had begun as subtle quivers on the Earth's surface were now transforming into a full-blown cataclysm. The shockwave of the quake, combined with the relentless surge of the tsunami, was beginning to reshape the landscape below in ways that defied comprehension. Ricoa's gaze lingered on the devastation, the twisting outlines of once familiar structures, the dark, rolling clouds that seemed to be nature's own warning signal. A profound mix of relief and terror overwhelmed him. Relief, because his early takeoff had granted him and his passengers a reprieve from the fate that had befallen those left behind. Terror, because the full magnitude of the disaster was only just beginning to reveal itself. In that suspended moment, soaring high above a land in chaos, Ricoa realized that sometimes survival hinged not on conventional wisdom, but on the mysterious impulses that compel us to act against the grain. As he steadied himself for the remainder of the flight, he couldn't help but wonder about the fragile line that separated life from death, and how, in this instance, a mere 3 minutes had become the fulcrum upon which countless destinies now balanced.